Mason Reed, a gifted single father and former Whitmore Automotive diagnostic specialist, was fired and quietly blacklisted after refusing to alter a report identifying a dangerous electrical fault that could disable vehicle systems. 2 years later, struggling as a mobile mechanic, Mason stops during a storm to repair a stranded luxury sedan suffering from the exact defect he had previously reported. He refuses payment from its elderly driver Arthur, unaware he is Arthur Whitmore, the company's founder and chairman. Arthur investigates and discovers executive Camille Carrington had altered Mason's report, secretly implemented Mason's repair procedure, concealed the safety problem, and destroyed his career to avoid an expensive recall. Arthur arrives at Mason's home with executives and security confronts Camille with the evidence and suspends her. Mason initially refuses to return but accepts a position reporting directly to the board's safety committee. Answering his findings cannot be suppressed. His investigation confirms the defect across thousands of vehicles, prompting a $31 million inspection and repair program. Whitmore restores Mason's reputation, compensates his lost income, and appoints him lead field safety consultant. Months later, Arthur personally returns Mason's borrowed raincoat and thanks him for helping bring both his car and company back to the road. The rain came down white and sideways the night I knelt beside a stranger's dead sedan on a county road. My hands frozen stiff as I traced one wire at a time under a hood that cost more than my house. He wore an expensive coat and never offered a name that meant anything. And I told him only that I was a single father who made a living fixing cars. I refused his money, closed the hood, and drove my old pickup home. The next morning, heavy engines woke me before my alarm did. 6 black sport utility vehicles had sealed off my driveway. Then the middle door opened. For almost 2 years, I had been the best diagnostic technician in eastern Pennsylvania that nobody would hire. I worked out of a 1996 pickup with 240,000 kilometers on it and a toolbox bolted to the bed. And I ran a 1-bay garage behind a small rented house on the edge of a town most people only saw through a windshield on their way somewhere better. I charged $40 an hour when the shops in the county charged $160, and I still lost work to men who could not read a wiring diagram if you spelled it out for them. My daughter June was 11, and she had learned to tell the difference between the months when I got paid and the months when I got promises. She never complained about either one, which somehow made it worse. I understood exactly how I had gotten there, and that understanding was the heaviest tool I carried. Before all of this, I had been a senior diagnostic specialist inside the Whitmore Automotive Service Network. The person they flew to other states when a vehicle did something the manual said was impossible. I made $94,000 a year. I had health insurance, and I had a badge that opened doors in buildings with marble floors. Then I found a pattern in a high-end sedan line. A fault in the electronic control architecture that appeared under a very specific combination of heat, humidity, and low voltage load. It was not constant, which is why it had slipped past everyone. It was also not random, which is why it terrified me. The pattern showed up in 11 vehicles across 4 states in a single quarter, and every one of them presented the same way. Drivers reported a momentary loss of throttle response, an instrument cluster that blinked and reset, and in 3 cases, a full shutdown of assisted braking for somewhere between 2 and 5 seconds. 2 seconds at 70 kilometers an hour is more than 200 feet of road that belongs to nobody. I wrote it up the way I had been trained to write things up, with logged fault codes, environmental conditions, replicated test results, and a proposed verification procedure that any dealership could run with equipment they already owned. I signed the report on a Thursday afternoon, and I believed with the whole flat certainty of a man who has done his job correctly that the system would take it from there. That was the last afternoon of my old life, and I did not know it. Camille Carrington ran the region, and she came from money. The way weather comes from the west constantly and without apology. She was 42, then sharp as a paring knife, and her family had sat on the Whitmore board through 3 generations. She called me into a conference room with glass walls and asked me very pleasantly to sign an amended version of my own report that attributed every one of those 11 incidents to improper owner maintenance. When I said no, the pleasantness went out of the room like heat out of an open door. She told me in front of 6 managers that a mechanic ought to understand where he stands instead of imagining he can teach a board of directors how to run a company worth billions of dollars. Nobody at that table looked up from their notepads, and I remember thinking that the silence cost them nothing and cost me everything. 6 weeks later, I was terminated for failure to follow established process. A phrase broad enough to mean whatever the person holding it needs it to mean. What came after was quieter and far more effective. I applied to 11 dealerships and 2 independent chains in 3 counties, and every single one of them liked me in the interview, called my references, and then stopped answering the phone. One service manager, a decent man named Walt Prine, finally told me the truth in a parking lot because he did not have the stomach to say it inside the building. My name had been put somewhere it should not have been, and anyone who hired me would find their parts allocations and warranty reimbursements developing mysterious delays. I did not sue because a lawsuit against the Carrington family is not a legal proceeding. It is a spending contest, and I had $800 in savings. I kept a copy of my original technical notes in the bottom of my toolbox under the sockets the way other men keep a photograph. So that was my life on the evening of the 11th of April. Driving home through a storm that had been building all afternoon with $90 in my pocket from replacing a water pump on a school teacher's minivan. The wipers onto my truck were worn down to the metal, and I could not afford to replace them until Friday. June was at my sister Diane's house for the night, which meant nobody was waiting up for me, which meant I had no real reason to hurry and no real reason to stop. I saw the hazard lights first, a slow orange pulse against the guardrail about a mile past the reservoir bridge. Then I saw the shape of the car itself, long and low and pale under the rain, and a man in a dark coat standing beside it with no umbrella and no hood, just standing there getting soaked with the particular stillness of someone who has run out of ideas. He was in his early 70s, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that does not come from a gym. His coat was cashmere and ruined, and his shoes were the sort you notice because they make no sense on a wet shoulder in the middle of nowhere. I said I was a mechanic and asked what it had done before it quit. He said his name was Arthur, that the dashboard had lit up like a carnival, and then everything had gone quiet, and that his phone had found no signal since the bridge. He did not tell me anything else about himself, and at the time I registered that as ordinary caution from a wealthy man alone on a dark road. Which it partly was. The car was a Whitmore Aurelian current generation, the model with the integrated control architecture, and a sticker price north of $140,000. I knew every inch of that platform because I had spent the last 18 months of my career inside it. Something in my chest tightened in a way I did not enjoy, and I told myself it meant nothing that there are thousands of these cars, and this was simply the county where rich men drive. I pulled my scan tool in my old toolbox out of the truck bed, and the toolbox is scratched and dented and has my father's initials scraped into the lid with a nail. Arthur looked at it for a long moment. Then he asked with real curiosity, and not a trace of cruelty, whether I honestly believed I could repair this car on the side of the road. I have been asked that question in worse tones by smaller men, so it did not land the way it might have. I told him I would not know until I looked at it. He stepped back and let me work holding my flashlight when I asked him to, and he held it steady, which is rarer than you would think. I got the hood up, ran my scanner, and watched the codes populate the little cracked screen one after another. Communication loss on the powertrain bus. Intermittent low-voltage reference fault, a supervisory module that had gone into a protective state and refused to come out. I read that sequence 3 times in the rain, and the cold I felt had nothing to do with the weather because it was the exact signature I had documented 2 years earlier and been called a liar for. I found what I expected to find. A connector at the harness junction behind the left front wheel liner had corroded at the pin seat, and under a load of moisture the reference voltage dropped just far enough that the supervisory module read it as a fault and shut the whole conversation down. I cleaned the pins, applied dielectric grease from a tube that had been in my box since 2019, reseated the connector, and cycled the system. The car woke up like nothing had happened. All that beautiful, expensive light spilling out onto the wet asphalt. Then I did one more thing that was not strictly my business. I routed a temporary jumper to give that reference circuit a redundant ground path so that if the connector went marginal again on his way home, the module would not drop out and leave him coasting in the dark. I closed the hood and told him plainly not to drive that car any farther than he had to, and to have the entire harness and the supervisory module inspected by a technician who would actually pull the logs instead of clearing them. He asked how a mobile mechanic came to know a proprietary Whitmore system that thoroughly. I said I used to work for them, and I left it exactly there because self-pity on a roadside is a bad look on anyone. He reached into his coat and offered me a fold of bills, several hundred at least, and he held it out with the casual certainty of a man who has never had an offer of money refused. I told him, no, it had taken 20 minutes. He did not put the money away. He looked at my truck with its mismatched tailgate and at my soaked jacket and at the wet cardboard of a man who plainly needed exactly what he was holding. And I could see him working the arithmetic and getting an answer that did not balance. He asked me why. I told him he was stuck in the rain. I helped him, and that was all there was to it. Then I gave him the spare rain slicker from behind my seat because he was 72 years old and shaking. And I told him to leave it on the porch of any house he liked when he was done with it. He put it on. He looked ridiculous in it. A bright yellow plastic thing over $4,000 of cashmere, and he did not seem to care at all. I was halfway to my truck when he called after me and asked for my full name. I told him Mason Reed, and for 1 second no longer than the space between 2 wiper strokes. Something moved across that old man's face that I could not read at the time and have never forgotten since. It was not surprise exactly. It was the look of a man who has just found the corner piece of a puzzle he had been told did not have one. He thanked me, got into his car, and I watched his taillights go east until the rain took them. I went home, ate cereal standing up over the sink, because that is what you do when your daughter is not there to see it, and slept badly. In the morning, I picked June up from Deanne's, drove her to school, and took a call about a starter motor on the far side of the county. I did not think about Arthur more than twice all week, and both times it was about the fault codes rather than the man. Arthur Whitmore, on the other hand, thought about very little else. And this is the part of the story I only learned afterward in pieces from 3 different people who were in the rooms where it happened. He drove that sedan directly to the Whitmore Technical Center in Allentown at 8 the next morning and handed the keys to the director of engineering validation. Then he asked them to tell him what had gone wrong with it and to be very careful because he already knew. The search returned 406 documents. Buried in the second tranche was a technical incident report dated 2 years and 1 month earlier, covering 11 vehicles across 4 states with logged conditions, replicated results, and a proposed verification procedure. The name on the signature line was Mason Reed. Arthur read it twice and then asked the obvious question, the one that anybody would ask, which was why the man who first identified this problem was no longer employed by the company. The answer that came back from Human Resources was clean and short and said he had been separated for unprofessional conduct and failure to follow established process. Arthur, who had built this company out of a 2-bay shop in 1974, had spent 50 years learning that clean, short answers are usually a door with something behind it. He gave the file to Elena Brooks, the lead counsel to the board, a woman of 48, who had never in her career been accused of enthusiasm and had also never been wrong about a document. She found it in under 6 hours. The version of my report sitting in the corporate archive was not the version I had signed. 3 paragraphs describing the potential for the system to enter an unsafe operating state had been removed. The recommended fleet-wide verification had been downgraded to a customer education note, and the conclusion had been rewritten to attribute the incidents to owner maintenance. The metadata showed the revision had been made 9 days after my signature by an account credentialed to the regional executive office. The approving authority listed on the change was the office of Camille Carrington. Back on my side of the world, none of this existed. What I got was a phone call at 9:40 on a Thursday morning from a service manager at the Whitmore dealership in Bethlehem. A man who had not returned any of my calls in 2 years and now sounded like someone speaking from inside a closet. He said people had been asking questions about me. Not the police, not a customer, but people from corporate, and more than one of them. And they had asked for my address. I asked him what he had told them, and he said he had told them the truth, which is that I was the best technician he ever worked with, and he had been instructed not to hire me. Then he said, and I remember this word for word, that he was sorry and hung up before I could ask him for. I stood in my garage with a torque wrench in my hand and felt the floor tilt about 2 degrees. Camille called 40 minutes later. It was the first time I had heard her voice in almost 2 years, and it had not changed at all. That smooth Philadelphia boarding school flatness that makes an insult sound like a weather report. She did not ask how I was. She did not use my last name. Her first sentence was a question delivered like a scalpel. What exactly had I said to the man in the rain? I told her honestly that I did not know what she was talking about. and there was a pause on the line long enough for me to hear a door close on her end. Then she began, and it all came back like a smell from a house you grew up in. She warned me not to leverage a roadside coincidence into resurrecting old and thoroughly discredited allegations. She reminded me that I had signed non-disclosure agreements, which was true, and that I had been terminated for cause, which was not. She suggested that a man in my circumstances should be very careful about the enemies he chose, given that I had a child and a lease and a business that consisted of a truck. I asked her one question, which was who Arthur was. The silence that followed was the first real thing she had ever given me. She did not answer it. Instead, she said something I have repeated to myself many times since, usually while laughing. She told me there are rooms a man who fixes cars will never walk into, and that I should not confuse one lucky night with power. Then she hung up. I stood there with the phone still against my ear and understood two things at once. The first was that whoever the old man in the rain had been, he was somebody who could make Camille Carrington afraid. The second was that I had, without intending to, stepped back onto a field I had been thrown off of, and that people like her do not leave that alone. I looked out the front window, and the world had rearranged itself. 6 black sport utility vehicles, identical windows tinted past legal in this state, were pulling up in a line along the front of my property, and 2 of them turned in and blocked the driveway completely. They parked with the geometry of people who have done it before, angled spaced covering the approaches. My neighbor Darren Halvers came out onto her porch in a bathrobe holding a coffee cup she never drank from. Across the street, the Petrosky boys stopped in the middle of loading their landscaping trailer and just stood there. In 11 years on that street, nothing had ever happened that made anyone look up, and now everyone was looking at my house. June came around the corner in her school clothes with one sock on, and I have never moved that fast in my life. I told her to go to her room, stay away from the front windows, and not come out until I called her. And I said it in the voice I almost never use, so she went. Then I did the arithmetic every working man does at that moment, which is, what have I done? What can they say I have done? And what can I afford? I decided they were lawyers or corporate security, and that Camille had sent them to frighten me off the phone call, and that if I stayed inside it would look like I had a reason to. So I put on my boots, and I walked out my own front door into the cold, and I closed it behind me. The doors on the vehicles opened almost together, and men in dark suits stepped out onto my gravel. 8 of them that I could count, none of them in any hurry. The one who came toward me was in his late 50s, built like a retired lineman with a gray crew cut and an earpiece and a manner so calm it was somehow worse than aggression. He stopped about 6 feet away, which I later learned is deliberate, and he asked if I was Mr. Mason Reed. I said that I was, and then I said the only thing I had prepared, which was that if they were here about the car, I had not taken anything out of it. It was a stupid thing to say, and I have thought about it since, and I have decided that it was not stupid at all. It was simply what 2 years of being treated like a thief will put in a man's mouth. He smiled. That was not in the script I had written in my head. He said his name was Graham Hull, and that he was the director of corporate security. And then he turned slightly and looked back at the middle vehicle in the line, and the rear door opened. The man who got out was tall and silver-haired and 72 years old, and I knew him instantly and did not know him at all. The ruined cashmere was gone. He wore a charcoal suit that fit the way suits do when nobody has ever had to guess at your measurements. And as he came up my driveway, the 8 men in dark suits arranged themselves around him without a word being spoken. And 3 people I would later learn were senior executives got out of the last vehicle and stood behind him with their hands folded. The old man from the rain walked up to me and put out his hand. I shook it. Graham Holt said in the ordinary tone you would use to pass someone the salt that the chairman would like a few minutes of my time. Chairman Whitmore. I want to describe what happened inside my chest at that moment, but the honest version is that nothing happened because everything stopped. The name on the building I had been thrown out of, the name on the badge I had turned in, the name on the report that had been rewritten to make me a liar. I had spent 20 minutes in a rainstorm fixing that man's car, and I had turned down his money, and I had loaned him a $4 plastic rain slicker from behind the seat of my truck. He said good morning and apologized for the size of the arrival, and said that at his age he no longer got to choose how many vehicles came with him. And then, before I could assemble a single sentence, A silver sedan came up the street too fast and swung into the last open space at the curb, and Camille Carrington got out of it in a camel coat with her heels sinking into the gravel edge of my lawn. She had driven from Philadelphia. She had left, I found out later, at 5 in the morning. She looked at the vehicles and at Graham and at Arthur, and then at me standing on my own property in work boots, and I watched her build a story out of it in about 2 seconds and choose to lead with it. She got to us and she spoke before Arthur did, which was the single most expensive decision of her professional life. She said good morning to the chairman and thanked him for handling this personally. She said she had come the moment she understood there had been unauthorized interference with a company vehicle. Then she gestured at me, not quite pointing, and said that Mason had always had trouble with professional boundaries, and that this was in fact part of why they had needed to let him go. It was fluent, and it was practiced, and it landed on my own front lawn in front of my neighbors, and my daughter was 30 feet away behind a bedroom window. Arthur did not respond. He simply looked at her with the patient, entirely neutral attention of a man who has decided to let someone keep talking. Most people would have felt the temperature and stopped. Camille had spent her whole life in rooms where silence from the head of the table meant permission. So she read it exactly backward and pressed forward. She said, for the benefit of everyone standing in my driveway, that I was a disgruntled technician with a history of inflating routine maintenance issues into what I like to call safety crisis. That my termination had been thoroughly reviewed, and that whatever I had told him on that road should be understood in that context. She said that people in my situation often look for a wealthy audience. She said it while looking straight at me, and for a moment I was back in that glass conference room with 6 managers studying their notepads. The air in that driveway changed the way air changes before a storm all at once and with no sound. Camille said she had been briefed. Arthur asked whether she had read it. She said she had reviewed a summary. He nodded slowly. The way you nodded an answer that has told you everything you needed. And he asked Elena Brooks to come up from the second vehicle. A woman in her late 40s in a gray suit walked over with a leather portfolio, and she had the particular unhurried movement of a person carrying documents that have already won the argument. Camille's chin came up half an inch. I have replayed that half inch 100 times. Camille went first because she still believed she could steer it. She said the incident on the road was a rare confluence of environmental factors, statistically insignificant, and that isolated connector corrosion was a known characteristic of any complex vehicle in a wet climate. It was a good answer. It was the same answer I had heard in that conference room 2 years earlier, and hearing it again in my own driveway was like listening to a recording of the worst day of your life. Arthur let her finish. Then he asked why an identical fault code sequence appeared in a company technical report filed 25 months ago. Camille said she was not familiar with every report generated in the region. Arthur said this one had her office's approval stamp on the revision. Elena opened the portfolio. She held it so that I could see it too, which I do not think was an accident. There printed and tabbed was my report, not the rewritten one. Mine, the version I had signed on a Thursday afternoon, and assumed had been shredded with my handwriting in the margin of page 4, where I had noted the ambient humidity of the test bay. 11 vehicles, 4 states. The loss of signal event described precisely the specific combination of heat, humidity, and low-voltage load required to reproduce it. The risk that the supervisory system would enter an unsafe operating state, and the verification procedure I had proposed laid out in 5 steps that any dealership technician could perform in under an hour. Camille did not concede. I will give her that much because people who fold quickly at least have the decency to know what they are. Instead, she changed the shape of the fight, which is what people like her always do, and she went after the only thing about me she had ever considered relevant. She said that a service technician without an engineering degree is not qualified to make determinations at the level of system design, and that the report in Elena's hands was an opinion from a man who repairs vehicles, not a person who designs them. She said it in a reasonable voice, the one for boards and juries, and she said it standing in front of a house that has vinyl siding to a man holding car keys, and she genuinely believed it was the strongest card she had. I answered her then for the first time that morning, and I did not raise my voice because I had learned in that conference room what volume costs you. I said I had never once claimed to have designed that car. I said I had never written a word about what the engineering was supposed to do. I said my report described what the vehicle actually did on 11 occasions, under conditions I had documented and reproduced, and that a car does not care what degree is hanging on the wall of the man watching it fail. I said that if her position was that only the people who designed the system are permitted to report the system breaking, then she had built a company that can never find out. It is wrong. Arthur turned his head and looked at me, and something in his expression settled the way a mechanic's does when the noise finally matches the diagnosis. Then Arthur told all of us why he had been on that road. He said that over the previous 7 months, he had personally received a number of owner complaints forwarded from a customer relations channel that still routed to the founder's office because he had set it up in 1981 and nobody had ever dared shut it off. He said that each time he had raised these complaints with the regional executive team, he had been assured there was no common pattern, that the incidents were unrelated, and that the data did not support further inquiry. He said he had heard that phrase, "no common pattern," in 4 separate meetings, and that after 50 years in this business, he had developed an allergy to it. So he had quietly pulled several vehicles from the field, put them in personal service, and started driving them himself. The sedan that died in the rain was one of them. That landed on Camille like weather. It meant the breakdown had not been bad luck. It had been a test she did not know was running, and the results had been read by a stranger on the shoulder of a state road in under 20 minutes. Arthur said it out loud in case anyone had missed it. He said that a mobile mechanic with a 15-year-old scan tool had identified in a rainstorm the exact failure that her division had spent months telling him did not exist. He said that the mechanic had then installed a temporary redundant ground path, refused payment, and given him a rain jacket. He said it without any drama at all, which was what made it unbearable. 2 of the executives standing behind him were now looking at their shoes. Camille's composure came apart in increments, and the first thing to go was her hands. She said the correspondence from customer relations had never been escalated to her personally. She said her team had followed the established review protocol. She said that if there had been a gap in reporting, it had occurred below her level, and she would find out who was responsible. Arthur listened to all of it without moving. And then he asked the question that ended her career, though it would take another 11 weeks and a board vote to formalize what everyone standing in my driveway already knew. He asked her quite gently that if Reed had been wrong, why had it been necessary to alter his report? Elena laid the revision history on top of the portfolio. It was a single page, and it was more than enough. Timestamp user credential. The 3 deleted paragraphs shown in strike, through the downgraded recommendation, the substituted conclusion, and the approval line with the office designation. Camille looked at it for what felt like a long time. She said the edit had been a formatting standardization. Elena said in the driest voice I have ever heard a human being use that the standardization had removed the word unsafe on 4 occasions. Nobody laughed. That is when the contempt that had been standing in my driveway turned into something else entirely, which was a woman explaining herself out loud in front of witnesses on the front lawn of a man she had once said would never enter the room. Graham Hole brought a second folder from the lead vehicle, and Arthur told him to give it to me rather than to Elena. It was thin, maybe 6 pages, and it was not what I expected. I had assumed it would be paperwork about Camille, a termination letter, something with her name in bold at the top. It was an internal memorandum from the Regional Technical Operations Office, dated 4 months after my dismissal, distributed to 11 service centers and marked for internal reference only. I read the first page standing up with everyone watching, and by the middle of the second page I had to stop and start it again because my eyes were going faster than my understanding. It was a service instruction. It described a connector inspection at the harness junction behind the left front wheel liner to be performed on specified vehicle identification ranges whenever those vehicles came in for any unrelated service. It specified a pin seat cleaning procedure, a dielectric compound, and a post-repair verification of reference voltage under simulated load. It was step for step the procedure I had proposed on page 5 of my report. They had not corrected the language of the memorandum enough to disguise it. The check intervals were mine. The measurement thresholds were mine. Somebody had taken my work, stripped my name off it, and turned it into a quiet internal fix. I understood the whole shape of it then, standing on my own gravel, and it was worse than being called a liar. They had not ignored my warning. They had believed it. They had believed it completely enough to build a repair program around it. and they had done that repair program silently on vehicles that happened to come in for oil changes and brake jobs, without telling a single owner why a technician was suddenly pulling the wheel liner off their car. Because to say it out loud, to acknowledge that the fault existed, would have required a formal safety campaign across tens of thousands of vehicles, an 8-figure cost, a regulatory notification, and a permanent line in the record of the executive whose region had produced it. So the fault got fixed, and the man who found it got erased, and both of those were solutions to the same problem, which was Camille Carrington's career. I looked up at her, and she was already looking at me, and for one moment there was nothing between us but the fact that we both now knew exactly what she had done. She started to move responsibility down the chain, saying the memorandum had been issued by technical operations under a director who had since retired, and that she could not be accountable for every field instruction generated in a region with 200 service centers. Arthur cut that off, and it was the first time all morning his voice had any edge in it. He said that a company where the person in charge is never accountable for the instructions issued in their name is not a company. It is a costume. He said that the investigation would begin immediately, that it would be conducted by the board's safety committee and outside counsel rather than by anyone in the regional structure, and that she was suspended from all operating authority effective now. He did not make a spectacle of it, and I have thought a great deal about why. He did not shout. He did not fire her in front of my neighbors. He did not give her the humiliation that would have let her tell herself afterward that she had been ambushed. He simply asked her to hand her access credentials to Graham Hole. She took the badge off the strap inside her bag and put it in his hand, and Graham thanked her, and that was somehow the coldest thing that happened all morning. She looked at me one more time, and there was real hatred in it. The clean, uncomplicated kind. The kind you get from someone who cannot locate a single thing they did wrong. I did not say anything clever. I have been asked since whether I wanted to, and the truth is that the sentence I had rehearsed in the shower for 2 years was sitting right there in my mouth, and it tasted like nothing. So I said the only thing I actually meant. I told her I never wanted her job. I told her I never wanted her office or her salary or her name on anything. I said the only thing I ever wanted was for her to stop asking me to say that a car was safe when I knew that it was not. Then I stopped talking, and she waited for more, and there was no more. And I think the absence of it hurt her worse than anything I could have added. She walked back to her sedan across the wet grass and drove away, and Doreen Halvers was still standing on her porch holding that same cup of coffee. The vehicles did not leave. 8 men in dark suits stood in my driveway in the cold, and Arthur Whitmore stood in front of my garage door looking at the hand-painted sign my daughter had made for it when she was 9. The one that says "Read Auto" in letters that get smaller at the end because she ran out of room. I said something about how I appreciated him coming to tell me, and that I hoped they got it sorted out. I thought that was the end of it. Arthur said not yet. He told me the real reason for the convoy. He said he had not driven 40 kilometers at 6:00 in the morning to correct my personnel file, and that the file would have been corrected by an email. He wanted me on the independent verification effort in the field on actual vehicles with the authority to open up anything I thought needed opening. I said no, and I said it fast enough to surprise myself. I told him I had spent 2 years learning what that company does to a man who tells it something it does not want to hear, and that I had a daughter, and that I could not afford to learn it twice. He did not argue, and he did not increase the offer, which is the only time in my life anyone with that much money has done me the courtesy of taking my first answer seriously. Instead, he made one adjustment. He said I would not work for the regional executive structure. I would not report to Camille or to her replacement or to anyone in the operating chain that had rewritten my report. He said I would report directly to the safety committee of the board of directors with Elena Brooks as counsel of record, and that any technical finding I submitted would go into the committee minutes verbatim and could not be edited by anybody below that level for any reason. Then he said the part that actually got me, which was that this arrangement would exist whether or not I was the person filling the job, because a company that could bury a report once could bury one again. I stood there in the cold for a while. Then I said I would come look at the cars, and we would see. 9 days later I walked into the Whitmore headquarters in Allentown through the front doors, which I had never done in 6 years of employment because technicians used the service entrance on the north side. I did not arrive transformed. I want to be clear about that because stories like this one usually end with the mechanic becoming a vice president and buying a boat, and that is not what happened, and it would not have been better. I wore a pressed shirt with no tie and the same boots, and I carried the same dented toolbox with my father's initials scraped in the lid because I had asked whether I could bring it, and Elena had said that she would consider it a personal favor. My hourly rate went from $40 to something reasonable. My hands did not change at all. What changed was the geometry of the room. There were 4 managers in that safety committee session who had known exactly who I was 2 years earlier, who had sat in that glass conference room and studied their notepads while Camille explained where a mechanic stands. 2 of them had stopped answering my calls afterward. When I came through the door with Elena, all 4 of them stood up. Nobody had told them to. There is a specific silence that happens when people who once decided you were nothing have to reorganize that decision in public, and I would be lying if I said I did not hear it. I sat down at the end of the table and opened my toolbox on the floor beside my chair, and one of them looked at it like it was a loaded weapon. The verification program ran for 6 weeks, and it covered 11,400 vehicles across the eastern region. What it found was narrower than my worst nights had suggested, and worse than the company had ever admitted. A batch of connector housings from one supplier plant produced across a 14-month window with a seal geometry that permitted moisture intrusion at the pin seat under sustained road spray. Not every car, not even most of them, but enough, and in a failure mode that put the vehicle into a degraded state at exactly the moment when the driver would least expect it. Whitmore opened a voluntary inspection and repair program before any regulator asked a single question, notified every affected owner by mail, and covered the work at no cost regardless of warranty status. It cost the company somewhere north of $31 million. It was announced in a 2-page release that nobody outside the industry ever read, which is exactly what a well-led safety problem looks like from the outside. The personnel side took longer and mattered more to me than I expected it to. Elena's review concluded that my termination had been executed on the basis of an altered record and a corrupted process, and the company issued a formal correction to my employment file, restated my separation as improper, and sent written notice to every dealership and independent operator in 3 states that had been made aware of my name. Walt Prine called me the day he got his copy, and neither of us said much, and neither of us needed to. There was a settlement for the lost income negotiated by an attorney I did not have to pay for, and it was fair without being a lottery ticket, which is the right way for that to go. And they gave me a title lead field safety consultant, which came with one piece of authority that I cared about more than the salary. I could refuse to sign off on a technical approval when the data was incomplete, and no one in the operating structure could override that refusal without putting their own name on a document that went to the board. There was a director in that final meeting, a man about my age with a very good haircut, who asked Arthur why the company was handing that kind of authority to a mechanic. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way you say a thing everyone in the room is thinking, and he probably believed he was being useful. Arthur took his glasses off and cleaned them, which I would learn is what he does before he says something he means. Then he answered him. He said that when every one of us was being paid to look somewhere else, this was the only man who was willing to look at the car. Nobody asked a follow-up question, and the meeting moved on, and I sat there with my toolbox against my ankle and my hands on the table, and did not trust myself to speak. 4 months later, on a gray Saturday in the middle of October, a single black sport utility vehicle came up my street and stopped in front of the house. Darren Halvers came out onto her porch again, which I found genuinely funny, and the Petrosky boys stopped loading their trailer again, and I walked out onto the driveway drying my hands on a shop rag. But there was no convoy this time, and no men in suits, and no attorney with a leather portfolio. Just Arthur, 72 years old, getting out of the passenger side by himself with a driver waiting in the car. He was carrying a folded yellow rain slicker $4 of plastic from a truck stop on Route 22, laundered and folded like a flag. I told him he could have had somebody mail it. He said that some debts a man ought to carry to the door himself. And then he handed me an envelope, and I assumed it was money because that is what envelopes from men like Arthur usually are. It was a photograph. The sedan repaired and clean parked in front of the technical center in Allentown, and on the back and fountain pen, in an old man's careful hand, one line. This car brought me home, and the man who fixed it brought my company back to the road. I did not put that photograph in my new office. It is taped to the inside of the garage door at eye level, where I see it every time I pull the door down. June came out onto the step in her jacket while we were standing there 11 years old and unimpressed by all of it. And after Arthur left, she asked me why I still spend my Saturdays fixing the neighbor's junk when I have a real job now with an office and a parking space. It was a fair question, and she deserved a real answer, so I gave her the only one I have. I told her that a broken car is still a broken car, no matter whether the person driving it is rich or poor, and that the whole trouble started because a lot of very well-paid people forgot that. She thought about it, said okay, and went back inside for a sandwich, which is what 11 is like. It had started to rain again by then, the thin, cold kind that comes in October. I pulled the garage door up and out at the end of the street. Somebody had their hood open and their hazard lights going, and I picked up my toolbox and walked out to see what was wrong with